A point-blank shot to the back of Abraham Lincoln's head amidst the roaring laughter of a theater opened the curtain on a flawless coup d'etat. The assassin was swiftly executed, guaranteeing he would permanently take the identities of his puppet masters to the grave. But the most cold-blooded piece of evidence lay in the diary recovered from his corpse, where the entries written just before 0 hour were surgically excised by a blade. The secret of who truly ordered the hit on Lincoln was bleached by the shadow state and locked away in classified vaults for over a century and a half. Today, we break those seals and open the black archives to expose the truth hidden within the exact pages that history deliberately tore away. The true mechanics of the American system were revealed to Lincoln almost immediately. To fund the mobilization of a massive Union army, the federal government required immediate and staggering injections of capital. When Lincoln approached the Eastern banking establishment, men whose allegiances were tied closer to European central banks than to the survival of the American Republic, he was met with an extortionate proposition. The bankers, fully aware of the existential threat facing the government, demanded interest rates ranging from 24 to 36%. This was not a loan. It was a financial hostage situation. They calculated that a desperate president would capitulate, effectively mortgaging the future of the United States to a private consortium for generations to come. The psychological impact on Lincoln following these private meetings was irreversible. He recognized that the men offering to save the Union were simultaneously setting the terms for its permanent economic enslavement. He was fighting a visible enemy in the Confederacy, but he was being strangled by an invisible enemy within his own financial apparatus. Lincoln's response to this extortion remains one of the most audacious and suppressed economic rebellions in modern history. He refused their terms. Instead, he bypassed the private banking monopoly entirely. Utilizing his executive wartime powers, Lincoln persuaded Congress to authorize the creation of fiat currency. He printed over $400 million in United States notes, famously known as greenbacks. These bills were backed not by gold sitting in a private vault, but by the sheer unyielding faith and credit of the United States government. They carried no interest. They were legal tender for all debts, public and private. In doing so, Lincoln committed the ultimate heresy against the global financial system. He proved that a sovereign nation did not need to borrow its own money from private bankers at exorbitant interest rates. He shattered the monopoly on money creation. To the citizens, the greenback was a tool of national survival. To the international banking elite, it was an existential threat to their global hegemony. The reaction from the European financial centers was swift and chilling. Lincoln's creation of fiat currency challenged the established international financial system. By bypassing European banking monopolies, he weaponized the Union's economy, inadvertently making powerful enemies among global financial syndicates who viewed this debt-free model as a direct threat to their influence. This was not political rhetoric. It was a declaration of systemic war. Lincoln had not merely preserved the Union, he had weaponized its economy against the parasitic nature of central banking. By doing so, he transitioned from being a political leader managing a domestic crisis to a targeted enemy of an international financial syndicate. This psychological burden weighed heavily on Lincoln as the war dragged into its final, agonizing years. He was an isolated executive, Surrounded by men whose motives he could not trust, his own cabinet was infested with individuals deeply tied to the very financial and industrial interests he was actively defying. The true burden of his presidency was defined by this suffocating, systemic isolation. He walked the echoing halls of the executive mansion carrying the grief of hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers, while simultaneously fighting a silent, exhausting war against the corporate and financial vultures circling the Capitol. He understood that the apparatus was inherently ruthless. Operating without human empathy, it functioned purely on the cold mechanics of debt, leverage, and control. Lincoln's deep melancholy, often attributed to the stress of the war and personal tragedy, was fundamentally rooted in his stark understanding of this systemic ruthlessness. He was attempting to save a nation that the men around him merely wanted to own. As the calendar turned to 1864 and early 1865, the dynamic of the threat against Lincoln mutated. The Confederate Army was collapsing. The military victory of the North was assured, but the imminent end of the war introduced a new, highly volatile point of conflict between the president and the radical factions within his own government. The radical Republicans and the Northern industrialists did not view the impending peace as a time for national healing. They viewed the defeated South as a conquered territory, ripe for economic exploitation and political subjugation. They desired a punitive reconstruction, a systematic asset stripping of the Southern states that would transfer vast wealth into Northern corporate hands while maintaining permanent political dominance through military occupation. They wanted a scorched earth policy that would enrich the victors and permanently break the spine of the Southern agricultural economy. Lincoln's vision for a post-war America was diametrically opposed to this agenda. His second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his death, laid out a doctrine of profound leniency, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He proposed pardons for the majority of Confederate soldiers, a rapid readmission of the Southern states into the political fold, and a deliberate avoidance of punitive treason trials. He wanted to stitch the fabric of the nation back together as quickly and painlessly as possible. This was not merely a moral stance, it was a strategic effort to prevent a permanent festering insurgency. However, to the architects of the emerging deep state, Lincoln's empathy was a catastrophic liability. A healed, unified South would quickly regain its political footing and economic independence, blocking the corporate raid the Northern industrialists had meticulously planned. By the spring of 1865, the consensus within the shadows of Washington was absolute. Abraham Lincoln had served his purpose. He had held the Union together through the brutal crucible of war, acting as the necessary figurehead to rally the populace. But in peacetime, his financial policies and his doctrine of reconciliation threatened the total domination of the post-war economy by the financial and industrial elite. The machinery of the state operates on a simple, unforgiving logic. If an executive component threatens the financial survival or expansion of the system, that component must be excised. The debate over policy had ended. The era of political maneuvering was over. While traditional history points to the desperate vengeance of Confederate sympathizers, alternative historical theorists suggest a more calculated motive. They argue that Lincoln's post-war financial policies and his vision for a lenient reconstruction posed an existential threat to Northern industrialists and the international banking order, making his removal highly beneficial to those seeking to exploit the defeated South. The transition from a boardroom conspiracy to a physical execution requires a shift from political abstraction to cold, tactical logistics. You cannot assassinate the President of the United States without absolute control over the physical environment. By the second week of April 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond had fallen. General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. Washington, D.C. was engulfed in a hysterical, intoxicating euphoria. The citizens believed the bloodletting was over. The president, exhausted to his very marrow, believed he had finally secured the survival of the republic. But in the lexicon of covert operations, public euphoria is not a cause for celebration. It is the ultimate operational camouflage. The shadow state understand that when a target believes they are safe, their defensive perimeter collapses. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was not a crime of passion committed in the heat of war. It was a clinical, highly synchronized military ambush executed in the immediate, unguarded silence of peace. To understand the sheer systemic complicity of the events on the evening of April 14th, one must conduct a forensic architectural analysis of the crime scene. Ford's Theater. Do not view this building as a venue for cultural entertainment. View it through the eyes of an assassin preparing a kill zone. The presidential box, comprising boxes 7 and 8, with the partition removed, was structurally designed as a fatal funnel. It was elevated, offering a commanding view of the stage, but it possessed only one point of entry and exit. A narrow, dark corridor leading to a single outer door. Inside this cramped space, the president was seated in a velvet rocking chair, his back positioned directly toward the entryway. He was completely blind to his rear. There was no secondary escape route, no reinforced barrier, and no line of sight to identify an approaching threat. Once a hostile operative breached the outer door, the target was permanently trapped. However, a structurally vulnerable environment is useless if it is heavily guarded. The defining characteristic of a state-sponsored execution is the deliberate, unauthorized withdrawal of the target's security detail. In intelligence terminology, this is known as a security stand-down. The security protocol for the president during the wartime was officially under the jurisdiction of the War Department, controlled by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton, a man of ruthless ambition and deep ties to the radical punitive factions of the government, had explicitly denied Lincoln's request for his usual highly competent bodyguard, Major Thomas Eckert, for that specific evening. Stanton claimed Eckert was needed for critical telegraph work, a claim later proven to be entirely fabricated. Instead, the responsibility for guarding the single, unbarricaded door leading to the commander-in-chief was handed to a Metropolitan Police officer named John Frederick Parker. To grasp the calculated malice of this operation, one must analyze the personnel file of John Frederick Parker. Parker was not an elite security operative. He was, by every documented metric, one of the most corrupt, undisciplined, and unreliable patrolmen in the city. His official disciplinary record was a catalog of gross negligence. He had been brought up on charges for sleeping on duty, being drunk on patrol, frequenting brothels while in uniform, and using insolent language to superior officers. Yet on the night the president was most vulnerable, out of a police force of hundreds of capable men, this specific officer was assigned to the door of the presidential box. This assignment was not a bureaucratic oversight. In a covert operation, you do not assign a disciplined, incorruptible guard to a door you need breached. You assign a man whose documented history of negligence provides perfect, plausible deniability. You assign a man who can be relied upon to fail. If the president is killed, the system does not take the blame. The system simply points the finger at the drunken, incompetent policeman. It is the ultimate insulation of the architects from the mechanics of the murder. At approximately 10 p.m., exactly as the system required, John Parker abandoned his post. He did not simply step away to stretch his legs. He left the theater entirely. He walked out the front doors and proceeded to Taltavel's Star Saloon, the tavern located immediately next door. He sat down to drink ale, leaving the corridor to the president completely unguarded. The single outer door was not locked. The vulnerability was no longer theoretical. It was active. The perimeter had been intentionally collapsed. Simultaneously, the designated triggerman was making his final approach. John Wilkes Booth is historically recognized as a fanatic driven by Confederate allegiances. However, researchers investigating the systemic failures of that night often point to his unprecedented access within the theater and the suspicious ease of his movements, raising questions about whether he acted entirely without high-level complicity. He moved freely through the theater because he was a known entity, but his actions indicate pre-operational support. On the afternoon of the assassination, Booth used his familiarity with the theater to prepare the kill zone. He carved a hole through the inner door of the presidential box to monitor his target and prepared a wooden brace to jam the outer door. While these actions showcase the chilling premeditation of a killer, some analysts argue such undisturbed preparation in a high-security environment points to a catastrophic, perhaps intentional collapse of defensive protocols. Booth's selection as the assassin was a stroke of logistical brilliance by the Shadow State. Because he was a renowned actor, his presence in the backstage areas and corridors raised absolutely zero suspicion. More importantly, Booth knew the architecture of the play being performed that night, Our American Cousin, with the precision of a metronome. He did not need to guess when to strike. He possessed the script. He knew that in Act 3, Scene 2, there was a specific moment when only one actor, Harry Hawk, would be on the stage. He knew that Hawk would deliver a specific comedic line. "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sockdologizing old man trap." Booth knew that this specific line invariably triggered the loudest, most sustained roar of laughter from the audience. Consider the chilling, mechanical precision of this execution. The system did not merely want to kill the president. They wanted to execute him with absolute, flawless efficiency. The weapon provided to Booth was a single-shot .44 caliber Philadelphia Derringer. It is a small, easily concealed pocket pistol. It is devastating at point-blank range, but it holds only one bullet. It takes nearly 20 seconds to reload. An operative carrying a single-shot weapon into an assassination attempt must possess absolute, unquestionable certainty that he will face zero physical resistance before pulling the trigger. If a guard is present, if the door is locked, the weapon is useless. The deployment of the Derringer is the ultimate forensic proof that Booth knew the security stand-down had been executed. He knew the door would be unguarded. He knew he only needed one bullet. Booth entered the dark, narrow corridor. He jammed the pre-prepared wooden wedge against the outer door, sealing the trap. He stepped up to the inner door. He looked through the drilled hole, confirming the silhouette of the president in the rocking chair. He waited in the stifling darkness, his finger on the trigger, listening to the dialogue echoing from the stage below. The dark reality of this specific moment is unparalleled. It represents the pinnacle of an engineered, state-sponsored betrayal. Abraham Lincoln, a man who had carried the psychological weight of a slaughtered generation, a man who had defied the international banking cartels to keep his nation solvent, was sitting in the dark, holding his wife's hand. He was finally allowing himself a moment of respite, a moment of human joy, entirely unaware that the government he had fought so desperately to preserve had quietly unlocked the door behind him and stepped aside. The architects of the plot demonstrated absolute ruthlessness, weaponizing the victim's basic humanity, his need for rest, his enjoyment of a comedy, as the ultimate camouflage for his murder. On the stage, Harry Hawk delivered the punchline. The audience of 1,500 people erupted into a massive, deafening roar of laughter. Booth opened the inner door. He stepped directly behind the velvet rocking chair. He raised the Derringer to within inches of the lower left side of the president's head. He did not hesitate. He utilized the joyous, roaring laughter of the American people as the acoustic suppressor for the gunshot that would alter the trajectory of the globe. The lead ball entered the skull behind the left ear, tore through the brain, and lodged behind the right eye. The president slumped forward, his spinal cord essentially severed, the physical vessel of his defiance instantly destroyed. The immediate aftermath was chaotic for the civilian audience, but operationally, it was proceeding exactly according to the script. Booth slashed at Major Henry Rathbone with a hunting knife, vaulted over the railing of the box, and landed on the stage, fracturing his fibula. He turned to the audience, raised his bloodied knife, and shouted the state motto of Virginia, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. To the terrified spectators, it was a moment of incomprehensible madness. To the architects of the deep state monitoring the situation from the shadows of Washington, it was the successful completion of the kinetic phase. The financial threat had been neutralized. The obstacle to the punitive exploitation of the South had been eliminated. The trigger had been pulled. But a successful assassination is only the first half of a coup d'etat. The assassin was now a fleeing liability. He was a man who possessed the names, the safe house locations, and the operational funding ledgers of the conspiracy. As Booth hobbled out the back door of the theater and rode off into the damp April night, the system pivoted with terrifying speed. The objective was no longer murder. The objective was containment. The hunt for the scapegoat and the subsequent activation of the cleaner was about to commence. The immediate aftermath of a state-sponsored execution is the most volatile phase of the operation. When John Wilkes Booth rode his horse across the Navy Yard Bridge and vanished into the damp Maryland night, he carried with him the ultimate liability of the deep state, the truth. To the terrified citizens of Washington, D.C., the ensuing 12-day manhunt appeared as a desperate, frantic pursuit of a madman. To the forensic intelligence analyst, it was a meticulously managed containment operation. The primary objective of the War Department, under the absolute control of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, was not to bring the assassin to justice. The objective was to ensure that the assassin never saw the inside of a courtroom. A public trial would require cross-examination. It would require the subpoena of financial ledgers, the tracing of telegraph communications, and the exposure of the deep subterranean ties between Booth and the political elite. The scapegoat had to be silenced, and the operation had to be permanently sanitized. To understand the brutal psychology of this phase, one must analyze the profound trauma inflicted upon the asset himself. John Wilkes Booth fled the capital under the delusion that he was the savior of the South. He believed he would be welcomed as a conquering hero, a modern-day Brutus who had slain the ultimate tyrant. This was the psychological conditioning required to convince a high-profile actor to pull the trigger. But as he hobbled through the swamps of Maryland and Virginia, his leg broken and festering, the reality of his situation slowly began to crush him. He was turned away by prominent Confederate sympathizers. He was forced to hide in freezing pine thickets, reading the newspapers that his co-conspirator Thomas Jones brought to him. In those ink-stained pages, Booth did not read of his glorious martyrdom. He read that he was universally condemned as a cowardly monster, disavowed even by the South he claimed to champion. Booth's desperation during those 12 days was not that of a misunderstood patriot, but the visceral panic of a burnt asset. It is the realization that you have not altered history. You have merely been used by it. He realized that the powerful men in Washington and Montreal who had funded his earlier operations, who had provided him with encrypted codes and safe routes, had instantly severed all ties. He was completely isolated. The system had locked the door behind him. He was no longer a covert operative. He was a loose end, waiting to be tied off by the very men who had initially weaponized him. The execution of this loose end was entrusted to a specific military detachment, the 16th New York Cavalry. But within this unit existed a man perfectly suited for the dark mechanics of a cover-up, Sergeant Boston Corbett. Historically, Corbett is portrayed as a religiously fanatic, highly unstable individual who acted on his own impulse. He had castrated himself years earlier with a pair of scissors to avoid the temptations of prostitutes. He was a man driven by extreme, unpredictable fervor. In the context of a deep state operation, you do not send your most rational, disciplined soldier to capture a man who holds the secrets of the Republic. You send a fanatic. You send a man whose inevitable deviation from official orders can be easily attributed to madness rather than systemic instruction. Corbett was the ultimate, deniable cleaner. On the night of April 26, 1865, the cavalry surrounded Richard Garrett's tobacco barn in Virginia, where Booth and his accomplice, David Harold, were cornered. The official orders issued by Secretary Stanton were explicit. Take him alive. The military required the appearance of a lawful arrest, but as the barn was set ablaze to flush the fugitives out, Boston Corbett circumvented the perimeter. He approached the burning structure, thrust the barrel of his Colt revolver through a crack in the wooden siding, and took careful aim at the silhouette of John Wilkes Booth moving in the firelight. Corbett pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Booth in the back of the neck, penetrating his cervical vertebrae and severing his spinal cord, a wound eerily surgically identical to the one Booth had inflicted upon Abraham Lincoln 12 days prior. When questioned by his furious commanding officers about why he had directly violated the explicit orders to capture the target alive, Corbett calmly replied, "Providence directed me." He claimed God had told him to shoot. The military brass ostensibly reprimanded him, but Secretary Stanton personally intervened, discharging Corbett and sending him home as a patriot. The shadow state protects its cleaners. As Booth lay paralyzed on the porch of the Garrett farm, suffocating as his autonomic nervous system shut down, he was reportedly asked if he had any final message. He looked at his paralyzed, useless hands and whispered his final words, "Useless, useless." To the romantic historian, this is the lament of a failed actor. To the intelligence analyst, it is the horrifying final realization of a pawn who finally understands the totality of the chessboard. He realized he was merely a disposable instrument. He died taking the names of his financiers, his handlers, and his co-conspirators in the federal government to the grave. The primary threat to the deep state had been neutralized. The blood transaction was complete. However, the physical elimination of the assassin is only the kinetic half of a successful cover-up. The second and far more crucial phase is the absolute domination and manipulation of the physical evidence. When Booth's body was searched by Colonel Everton Conger, several items were recovered from his pockets. Among them was a small red, leather-bound diary. This diary contained Booth's personal entries, detailing his thoughts, his movements, and, crucially, his interactions in the days immediately preceding the assassination. Conger rode directly to Washington and placed this diary directly into the hands of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. For 2 years, the existence of this diary was completely concealed from the American public and the judicial system. It was not entered into evidence during the military tribunal that sentenced Booth's minor accomplices to the gallows. It was buried in the dark archives of the War Department. It was only in 1867, during the bitter impeachment hearings of President Andrew Johnson, that Congress discovered the existence of the diary and legally forced Stanton to produce it. When the diary was finally opened under the unforgiving light of a congressional inquiry, a forensic anomaly of terrifying proportions was revealed. The pages detailing the final days leading up to April 14th, 1865, were gone. A total of 18 pages had been meticulously, cleanly sliced out of the binding with a sharp knife. The deliberate mutilation of those diary pages exposes the ultimate nightmare of a corrupted republic. It is the chilling realization that the highest echelons of the government possess the power, the audacity, and the absolute lack of morality to destroy physical evidence in broad daylight. The Warren Commission of the 1960s would later rely on ignoring evidence. The Stanton War Department of the 1860s simply mutilated it. The narrative of history was literally carved out of the binding. What was written on those 18 pages? Did Booth document his meetings with powerful Northern financiers? Did he record the encrypted telegraphs he received from Montreal? Did he list the names of the men inside the War Department who had guaranteed that the guard at the presidential box would abandon his post? We will never know. When the diary was finally opened under the unforgiving light of a congressional inquiry, a forensic anomaly was revealed. 18 pages detailing the days leading up to April 14th had been cleanly sliced out. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton claimed under oath that the pages were missing when the diary was handed to him, while the officers who recovered it insisted the book was intact. To this day, the missing pages remain one of history's darkest voids, fueling endless speculation about whose names and what orders might have been written on them. It was a classic intelligence standoff, a labyrinth of perjury designed to exhaust the public's pursuit of the truth. With the scapegoat dead, his diary mutilated, and the primary investigation under the absolute lockdown of the very men who stood to benefit most from the president's death, the system required only one final act to permanently seal the file. They needed to provide the traumatized American public with a spectacle of justice. They needed blood to satisfy the demand for vengeance, ensuring that the gaze of the nation never shifted upward toward the true architects of the crime. The rapid, unconstitutional military tribunal of the minor conspirators was about to commence, serving as the final brutal act of misdirection in the deep state's first successful coup. The machinery of a state-sponsored cover-up operates on a brutal, inflexible timeline. Once the primary target has been eliminated and the assassin has been silenced, the system faces its most critical vulnerability, the vacuum of public grief. If a traumatized nation is not immediately provided with a focal point for its rage, that rage will inevitably mutate into dangerous systemic scrutiny. The public will begin to ask the wrong questions. They will begin to look past the empty stage of Ford's Theater and upward toward the heavily guarded offices of the War Department. To prevent this, the shadow state must rapidly manufacture a spectacle of justice. They must provide the masses with a tangible, bleeding sacrifice. The final phase of the operation in the spring of 1865 was not a pursuit of truth. It was the clinical execution of a predetermined narrative. It was the staging of a military tribunal designed to hang the minor conspirators, satisfy the public's thirst for vengeance, and permanently seal the vault on the first successful coup d'etat in American history. To guarantee the outcome of this legal theater, the deep state first had to subvert the Constitution of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was murdered in Washington, D.C., a city where the civilian courts were fully operational and entirely capable of trying murder cases. However, a civilian trial requires a jury of peers. It requires strict evidentiary standards, the presumption of innocence, and the right to aggressive cross-examination by defense attorneys, who could subpoena high-ranking officials and demand the production of classified documents, such as Booth's mutilated diary. The architects of the cover-up knew that a civilian trial was a catastrophic risk. Therefore, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton leveraged the hysteria of the moment to bypass the civilian judiciary entirely. He decreed that the accused would be tried by a military commission. This was a calculated structural suspension of due process. In a military tribunal, the judges are military officers whose careers, promotions, and livelihoods are directly controlled by the Secretary of War. The rules against hearsay are aggressively relaxed. Most lethally, a military commission requires only a 2/3 majority to issue a death sentence, rather than the unanimous verdict required by a civilian jury. The tribunal was not a court of law. It was an administrative processing center for the gallows. By shifting the venue from the civilian realm to the military domain, the shadow state ensured that they were acting as the investigator, the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner. The verdict was signed before the first gavel ever fell. The treatment inflicted upon the accused during this period provides a terrifying glimpse into the psychological warfare deployed by the post-war power structure. The individuals captured, David Harold, George Atzerodt, Lewis Powell, and others, were not elite intelligence operatives. They were low-level sympathizers, drifters, and minor accomplices who had been manipulated by Booth. To ensure they did not mount a coherent defense or accidentally implicate the higher echelons of the conspiracy, the military subjected them to a form of psychological torture that was centuries ahead of its time. The prisoners were held in solitary confinement deep within the bowels of ironclad warships anchored in the Potomac River. By order of the War Department, they were forced to wear heavy, suffocating canvas hoods over their heads 24 hours a day. These hoods had no eye holes. They were tightly bound around the neck, plunging the prisoners into absolute darkness and sensory deprivation. The trauma of this confinement is unimaginable. For weeks, these men lived in a state of blind, suffocating terror, unable to see their captors, unable to speak, slowly losing their grip on reality. This was not a security measure to prevent escape. It was a deliberate, systematic dismantling of the human mind. The system was breaking them down, reducing them to compliant, terrified husks who would sit silently in the courtroom, incapable of defending themselves. The deep state understands that physical torture leaves marks that can be questioned, but psychological destruction leaves a clean, easily manageable victim. But the most chilling demonstration of the system's absolute terrifying power was the trial and execution of Mary Surratt. She was a 42-year-old widow who ran the boarding house where Booth and his accomplices had occasionally met. The evidence against her was entirely circumstantial, relying heavily on the coerced, contradictory testimonies of men desperate to save their own lives. In a functioning legal system, she would have been a peripheral witness or perhaps charged with a minor accessory offense. But the architects of the tribunal did not want justice. They wanted shock value. The decision to execute Mary Surratt was a calculated psychological strike against the American populace. By placing a civilian woman, a mother, in the crosshairs of a military death camp, the system was sending an undeniable message of absolute dominance. If the state possesses the power to drag a middle-aged widow out of her home, deny her a civilian trial, ignore her desperate pleas of innocence, and snap her neck on a military gallows based on whispers and hearsay, then no citizen is untouchable. The execution of Mary Surratt was designed to paralyze the public with fear. It demonstrated that the machinery of the state was entirely devoid of human empathy, moral hesitation, or legal constraint. Mary Surratt's realization that the law would not protect her because it had been weaponized to destroy her stands as a stark warning about absolute state power. On the blistering afternoon of July 7, 1865, the final act of the cover-up was executed in the courtyard of the old Arsenal Penitentiary. The visual of that day is a stark industrial monument to the efficiency of the deep state. 4 heavy wooden nooses hung from a massive crossbeam. The courtyard was packed with military personnel, and selected members of the press, there to bear witness to the state's triumph. The condemned were marched up the wooden steps. Their arms and legs were bound with white cloth. The hoods were pulled over their faces, returning them to the darkness they had endured in the ironclads. There were no grand speeches, no final revelations. At the signal of a commanding officer, the heavy wooden supports were knocked away. The trapdoors fell with a deafening mechanical thud. The bodies dropped, the ropes snapped taut, and the physical link to the truth was violently, permanently severed. As the bodies swung in the sweltering Washington heat, the public exhaled. The bloodlust was satiated. The newspapers declared that justice had been served, and the nation began the slow, painful process of looking away. But in the boardrooms of New York and the shadowed offices of the War Department, there was no grief. There was only the cold, quiet satisfaction of a successfully executed corporate takeover. With Lincoln dead and the investigation permanently closed, the victors immediately set about rewriting the economic and political architecture of the nation. The lenient, forgiving Reconstruction that Lincoln had promised was instantly discarded. Under the aggressive maneuvering of the radical Republicans, the South was carved up into military districts. The region was subjected to a brutal, punitive occupation designed to strip its assets and transfer its wealth into the hands of northern industrialists and railroad tycoons. More importantly, the threat to the international banking syndicate was systematically dismantled. The greenback, Lincoln's revolutionary debt-free currency, was gradually phased out, heavily restricted, and eventually tethered back to the gold standard controlled by the private banking elite. The National Banking Act solidified the monopoly of private financiers over the issuance of the nation's money. The system had successfully repaired the breach. The American economy was once again anchored in debt, and the men who generated that debt were back in absolute control. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln is not a tragedy of a divided nation. It is the origin story of the American shadow state. It is the blueprint that would be refined, expanded, and utilized again a century later in the sunlit streets of Dallas. The methods would modernize from a Derringer pistol to a high-velocity rifle, from a mutilated diary to a sanitized autopsy report, but the core systemic logic remained flawlessly identical. Create a security vacuum. Utilize a highly conditioned scapegoat. Execute the scapegoat before he can speak. Destroy the physical evidence under the guise of national security. And finally, traumatize the public into accepting a manufactured narrative by hanging the accomplices and weaponizing the media. We look back at the sepia-toned photographs of the 1860s and comfort ourselves with the illusion of distance. We believe that such raw, unchecked corruption was a symptom of a younger, less civilized era. But the architecture of power does not regress. It only perfects its camouflage. The deep state that was born in the blood and wood smoke of Ford's Theater did not dismantle itself after the Civil War. It entrenched itself. It built the modern intelligence apparatus. It solidified the military-industrial complex, and it established a permanent, unelected bureaucracy that views the democratic process as a theater piece for the masses. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln leaves behind a chilling, enduring legacy. It teaches the American people their first, most ruthless lesson in political reality. Never trust the absolute certainty of a government narrative when the physical evidence has been torn to shreds. A president can win a bloody continental civil war. He can command armies of hundreds of thousands of men. He can shatter the institution of slavery and hold a fractured republic together through the sheer force of his will. But the moment he threatens the financial lifeblood of the global banking elite, the moment he declares war on the invisible power of the shadow state, he will be struck down. The true sovereign power of a nation does not reside in the ballot box, nor does it sit in the velvet chairs of the executive mansion. It resides in the dark, waiting for the audience to laugh so it can pull the trigger without making a sound.